So hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Naruto is neglected by his family and becomes ANBU Black Ops. Part 5. If you guys enjoy this, what if, and you want the next part of this video, comment down below. And let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And also share this video with your friends. And check out the description. And check out my playlist. So let's start the video. Chapter 8. Inoichi stood there with the blade held firmly in his grasp. His face set in a look of remorse for what he was about to do. He looked Naruto in the eye from his spot at the door. His stomach churned seeing the nonchalant look of the redeeted man in white. It was daunting just gazing into those cold blues. In this moment, he realized things he had never truly noticed before. Such as the way Naruto's ANBU tattoo seems to have been peeled off. Or the way Naruto's eyes never gave away emotion. In his studies, he's learned to tell the motive of someone by the dilation of their pupils. Feelings of happiness, affection, or laughter will cause it to expand. Feelings of anger, hatred, or fear it closes. Not his. His eyes stay fixed in tiny pinpoint dots, unfazed by anything. It was haunting to have those two piercing bullets beaming into your own orbs. Wink. Inoichi Yamanaka. He said with a smile creeping onto his face. I must say, I am surprised. Inoichi took a timid step forward. No words would come to his mind as he thought up something to say. To what do I owe this visit? He asked as if he were oblivious to the kunai and fighting stance. I came to kill you. He said, completely out of breath for some reason. Naruto's smile never changed and he didn't care to get into a fighting stance. Kill me? He asked. What for? You know why? Inoichi shouted out. Naruto just raised an eyebrow as if he didn't. You're trying to use Ino somehow. I know it. Use her? Naruto asked curiously. Of course I'm trying to use her. He said, angering the man. She is my doctor after all. I'm trying to use her to get better and make it out of this deranged, psychotic mind of mine. He said, spitting that word out in a clear way to mock the man. Inoichi just adjusted his grip on his kunai, hoping to end this quickly. Naruto chuckled at him. Inoichi. Look, we both know you can't beat me. Even without chakra I could kill you. Naruto said. Inoichi wouldn't listen as he slowly began circling the younger man as a lion would, preparing to attack. Naruto sighed and when he did, Inoichi jumped into action. He charged Naruto with a roundhouse kick that was grabbed effortlessly and held onto with an unbelievable grip. Ah! He yelled, slashing at the boy's arm and jumping back. He didn't have much time to nurse his injury before he was kneed square in the chin and thrown against the wall. Naruto had his forearm in Inoichi's throat with his feet dangling from the ground. The hand with the kunai was pinned to the wall as well. You really wanted to kill me, huh? Naruto said, no sign of effort whatsoever for him. Huh. Inoichi, this was such a sad attempt at my life. Inoichi just gurgled, trying to rip the redeed's arm from his throat so he could breathe. Since you are probably going to die here pretty soon. I will give you a small bit of final satisfaction in knowing that you were right. Dr. Yamanaka plays quite the role in my escape and she has been progressing quite nicely. In fact, I think this right here may be the final key. The last hill to climb before she devotes herself to me. Inoichi was seeing absolute red at this point and he struggled harder and harder to break free but was having very little effect. Once she outlives her usefulness in my escape, I'll most likely allow her to live simply because of her services. But if she becomes a hindrance such as yourself, she just may have to greet you in the afterlife. He said with a sinister grin. Hell, since I'm a nice guy, I'll send your wife as well. He said with a laugh until he could hear keys urgently being shoved into his door from the outside. His grin increased as he released his grip on the man. He delivered a very sharp jab to a spot on his throat. Inoichi began coughing vehemently and he realized he couldn't speak. Naruto seemed to stumble back on his heels, giving him the chance he needed. He pounced on his downed form and held his kunai up with both hands intent on driving it straight through the chest of his target. Faintly, he heard a yell of Inoichi. Stop. He paused and looked up to the door to see Ibiki and two of the guards ready to take him. He couldn't speak, but he would not leave this place without ending his life. He brought the kunai up and drove it down as hard as he could. His strike ended when a kunai lodged itself into the center of his forehead. Naruto stared up lifelessly at the kunai just a few inches from his chest. He stared into the fading light in the eyes of the man who was leaking blood on his face. A very slight smile creeped onto his face watching Inoichi's body slump lifelessly off to the side. This would definitely move things along. Ino sat in her room staring at her ceiling, her mind gone completely. She was feeling a little anxious as she sorted out her recent emotions for the things in her life, mainly Naruto. This was supposed to be a professional relationship between them and yet she felt so connected. How deeply was she into it? She couldn't tell. What would be the repercussions of this turning into love? That was the real question at this point. What would her friends think? Well, her old friends. Namely Mito and Menma. Or the village. What would happen to her for falling in love with a patient? She'd probably be locked up in the same institution. Separated by wall on wall, no more sessions, no more contact with her supposed love. She couldn't take that. Ino wished it were simpler. She wished it was as simple as just declaring him sane again and getting him out, but that wasn't the case. If she declared him sane, he'd possibly be moved back to the prison. That would definitely split them apart. Oftentimes, she wished they could just go. Just get out of the village and be together. But, what if her feelings weren't returned? What if Naruto didn't love her the way she loved him? Then what would she do? So many questions and no way to get them answered. There was a tap at her window next to her bed. She slowly looked over to see an ANBU agent. She sighed and looked back up to her ceiling. Her window slid open and the ANBU agent addressed her. Yamanaka-sama. It is to my dearest regret that I must inform you, Inoichi Yamanaka has been killed. Ino showed no sign of emotion whatsoever. In fact, he wasn't even sure if she heard him. If you would like, I could escort you to the hospital. Your mother is there. It's fine. Thank you. She said flatly, dismissing the man. The ANBU agent lingered there for a few seconds before shutting her window and leaving. Ino's gaze remained locked on her ceiling. No emotion shown whatsoever. These were the first signs of alexithymia. She didn't feel anything. She was supposed to feel sad about news like that. If it were a few months ago, she'd be completely heartbroken. Now, it was just like someone told her breakfast was ready. She remained there for another hour before rolling out of bed and throwing her sandals on, heading out the door. Walking into her old childhood home, Ino was greeted to the side of her mother and a glob of her friends comforting her. There was Kushina, Yoshino, Mito, Tsume, and others Ino didn't know. Her mother, dramatic as ever, was balled up on the couch with a tissue pressed firmly against her face. The others around her were whispering words of comfort that seemed to be doing nothing. Then, she saw Ino and, surprising to everyone, she saw Red. You. She spit out harshly at her. You. Fucking. She yelled as she stood up and tried to jump at her. Ino stood in her spot, confused but unfazed. The women around her did their best to hold her back, not sure what was happening. I fucking. She yelled out until her string of curses mushed together in her crying. God. If you had never taken that stupid case. He'd still be here. Fiori-chan. Kushina yelled among the others in disbelief at their friend's words. Calm down, you're just upset. She tried to reason with the crying woman. No. Get off me. She yelled, still trying to force her way to Ino. Get your fucking hands off me. She yelled, trying her damned hardest. Mito stood to her feet and led the still silent Ino out the door to defuse the situation. Ino stood on the porch looking out to her mother's garden for a few seconds. Before Mito could say anything, the blonde vegan walked down the pathway. Hesitant at first, Mito slowly followed her. On the way out of the garden, Ino plucked a rose from the bush and continued walking. Mito followed Ino, trying to think of something to say to her. She was a few paces behind her staring at the back of her head. She realized how long it must have been since they actually spoke. Of course she remembered the party a few days ago, but that was not a conversation. It was just drunk Ino starting mess, and they all understood. Truth be told, Mito was still a little angry up to the point she heard of Ino's father dying from her mother. She was angered by the heap of mess that took place between her and Sasuke. It wasn't something she was prepared to deal with, but after a long talk, they dealt with the issues and resolved the conflict. Now, staring at the blonde woman's back, she was mesmerized by how long her loose hair was. It was much longer now that it wasn't in her old ponytail. It was quite a bold-fashioned choice for Ino Yamanaka to let her hair flow freely. Thinking back, that's how it was at the party as well. Was it just her new style? Her hair aside, there was a lot different with the girl. She wasn't normal anymore. She was always quiet, a lot less social, and very condescending. Mito couldn't understand why that was. Maybe she just got out of a bad relationship. Or maybe she was in one. When Mito finally zoned out of her own thinking, she realized they were at the Hokage monument. Ino just stood there, staring out at the village with dead-looking eyes. Mito slowly crept up beside her. There were words on her mind, but her mouth refused to speak them. They were words of encouragement and questions for the scorned. For whatever reason, her tongue wouldn't extend them to Ino. She stared at the side of her face trying to get a read on her old friend. She had no shine in her eyes. No smile on her face. No tear stains or tears brimming in her eyes. For someone as expressive as Ino usually is, this was very unsettling. Mito. Ino called out slowly. Mito turned her head more towards her to display to her that she is listening. Are you in love? Mito blinked at that. In her mind, it was almost obvious what this was about. Ino was still in love with Sasuke, and she was jealous of her. It explains the party incident, but not much else. What could she say to make her feel better? What could she do? Yeah. Ino. She said. Yeah. Ino's eyes never shifted from the village. What does it feel like? Mito turned back to the village and thought about it. It's wonderful. Ino shook her head. But, what does it mean? Feel like? She repeated, putting emphasis on feel. Mito turned back to her, wondering what it was she wanted her to tell her. It feels like a warmth in your heart that burns when you're not with that person, but comforts when you are. Ino's hand came up and touched her heart, just poking at her chest for a second. Mito watched her curiously. Then, she started chuckling. Then giggling. Then laughing. Mito watched her laugh into the wind and saw that a tear ran down her face. When she finally calmed down, she was left there with a content smile and she turned to Mito. I'm in love, she said. Mito wasn't sure what to say since she still had a hunch she was talking about Sasuke, but she couldn't accuse her of such a thing without being certain. Ino's chuckling came back. HMHM. HMHM haha. Fuck. She yelled out, scaring Mito when she dropped to her knees. Mito quickly kneeled down next to her, rubbing her back. Ino. What's wrong? This is a good thing. Mito said, reassuring her. Ino just continued to cry as she shook her head. Is he taken? She asked cautiously. Ino shook her head and Mito released the breath she didn't know she was holding. At least it wasn't Sasuke. Then, what's the problem? Ino sat back on her heels and stared out to the village again, her eyes and cheeks puffy and red. She ran her hands through her hair and held it in place on top of her head. Mito. What would you do if, for whatever reason, you couldn't be with Sasuke? She asked her with desperation just oozing from her words. Mito was as confused as she'd been all night as she thought about it. If I couldn't be with Sasuke. She repeated the question to give herself a little time to think. I'd do just about anything I could do. I'd do anything to make it to where we can be together, she said after some thought. She had no idea the monster she just unleashed with her words of truth. Ino's red puffy eyes stared intently at the village, as if it were going to be the last time she saw it. Her heart was set in stone, and her objective was now apparent. Kushina sat next to Kiori as the last remaining friend there. It was well beyond 2 in the morning, but she refused to leave until Mito brought Ino back to speak with her mother. Kiori had eventually calmed down with her rant of blame placing and realized how ridiculous her accusation was. She was crying now because of it. She had just demonized her daughter for doing something she believed she could do. It wasn't Ino's fault. It was Inoichi's obsession with that man that caused this and nothing else. There was no one to blame here but Inoichi. Her heart throbbed as she thought of what she told her daughter. It was blame for the sake of blame and she wanted so badly to apologize to her. They had been waiting for 2 hours now. Mito finally came into the door, a confused expression on her face. Where's Ino? Kiori asked, hopefully. Mito looked at the woman somberly. She went home. Mito said. Kiori's tears came back full force and she bawled her eyes out. Kushina pulled the woman into her chest once again and began whispering sweet nothings into her ear as if it were a practiced skill. Mito, tell your father I'll be staying here with Kiori please. She told the Redeed who nodded to her and left. 2 hours later, Mito walked into her and Sasuke's apartment. It was dark and quiet so she figured he was asleep. She kicked her shoes off and headed to take a shower. While in there, she thought over what Ino and she actually talked about. It wasn't what she expected to discuss with someone who just lost their father. Why was she thinking about love when her father had just died? Why did she not even mention her father? Was she bottling it up? If so, then she'd have to fix that tomorrow. She'd have to reason with Sakura and Tenten to help her of course, since they were still a little mad about the whole party incident, but they'd understand when she told her the circumstances. Ino had been far too distant for far too long. When she finished with her shower, she dressed in a plain t-shirt and some shorts as she climbed into bed with Sasuke. As soon as she did, he wrapped his arm around her as if he had been waiting for her. She smiled and rubbed his forearm. Yeah, if there was anything that prevented her from being with Sasuke, she'd do absolutely anything. That was a fact. That begged the question, who was it Ino was talking about? What would she have to do for this mystery man she had fallen in love with? Mito prayed it was nothing insane, but by the way she was acting, she could take a guess it wasn't something innocent she was talking about. What if it were something like deserting the village? Or killing someone who was trying to kill him? Maybe she fell in love with a civilian who got into some kind of trouble. She would ask the blonde girl tomorrow. Maybe as her friends, they could help her in whatever this endeavor of love was. It was the right thing to do. The duffel bag over her shoulder and a hooded ANBU agent behind her, Ino walked into the asylum, instructing 2 of the guards that she was having a midnight session with her patient. Seeing the ANBU with her, the 2 nodded and went to retrieve the patient while she signed in. She and the ANBU went to the room and waited patiently. Ino, what are we doing here? The man asked, apparently being quite familiar with her. Ashi, just help me with this one thing please. She told him simply. Ashi stared at her curiously. He knew the patient she came to see, and he also knew what happened a few hours ago. If we're here to kill or harm him in any way, I will not participate. He said, watching her search through the big bag she brought with her. Ino rolled her eyes. We're not. She said, I'm just here to speak with him. Then why am I here? He asked her. I just wanted a friend with me. She said convincingly. Ashi looked at her and sighed beneath his mask. But why do I have to be in full uniform? Ino sighed at the continuous string of questions. So that you look more intimidating, Tashi. She said as if it were obvious. He looked at her in confusion once more. He was an ANBU as well. And I'm just a recruit. I don't think he'll be intimidated. He told her. Ino shook her head. Believe me, he will. She said with a sigh as they then waited in silence. When she could hear his footsteps coming down the hallway, she dug in her bag again and pulled out a bottle of blue pills. Here. She said, handing one to Tashi. Before he could speak she continued. Put it in your mouth and bite down on it. It's a Yamanaka family recipe. That will allow you to go into his mindscape with me. That's what I plan to do. It will make you feel a bit woozy at first, but it should pass. But that being enough of an explanation, he lifted his mask enough to slip the pill into his mouth and do as he was told. The door opened up to two guards bringing Naruto in. He looked over to Ino with a smile and didn't miss the way her lips curled up slightly. He then looked over to the blank-faced hooded ANBU agent a few feet behind her. When he was sat down, the two guards nodded to Ino and the ANBU agent before leaving the room. They sat there in silence, and Naruto looked as though he were about to say something. Well, Dottie began until he was cut off by Ino putting a finger up, silencing whatever he was about to say. He looked at her strangely for a second until the ANBU agent started to wobble on his feet. Naruto stared at him in confusion when he fell over and began convulsing. He looked back to Ino to see her smiling at him. He grinned back at her, catching on to whatever was happening. Hey. She said with a smile and watery eyes. Naruto smiled back at her. Hey. Ino bit her grinning lip, trying to find words to say. I brought you something. She said, happily pulling her bag up. Reaching in, she pulled out a bottle of ink and a brush with a few papers. Naruto smiled at her. For practicing your calligraphy and whatnot. She nodded his way. He nodded back. Oh yes, of course. He said as if it were obvious. He looked at her in amusement. What? She asked. Can't do it. She asked. He grinned and held his wrists up, showing her the cuffs as if she couldn't see them. She gave him a slick smile and began crawling across the table seductively. In a smooth motion, she pulled a kunai out, whirling it about before driving it down into the metal table, lodging it into the surface right between his hands. He didn't even flinch. Bet yourself out, Mr. ANBU. She mocked as she laid down on the table with her feet crossed behind her, much like a kid laying before a fireplace. Ah. Not gonna make it easy for me? He asked with a smile, remembering their first conversation. Where's the fun in that? She replied, catching on. Naruto chuckled and pulled the kunai from the table. After a bit of messing with the lock, the cuffs finally opened, freeing his hands. Rolling his wrists out, he stood up and removed his shirt, giving into quite the sight as she stared at his chiseled body that seemed like he hadn't missed a day of training. She grinned at him and watched as he laid the sealing paper in front of her and began marking it. You sure you know what you're doing? She asked. It's been a while. He smirked. I've seen these seals every day for 5 years. I know what I'm doing. Guess you're lucky they didn't put any on your back then, huh? She asked him. He chuckled. That, my dear, is the confidence of these simple-minded fools. Like me? She asked him playfully as she flipped over to her back. He continued to mark the seals on the sheet of paper. Well, you're nothing like them now, are you? He asked rhetorically. No. You're slightly better. Slightly? She asked him. He put the brush down and stood to where his face was directly over hers. Ino's eyes continued to dart between his lips and his eyes as he spoke. Yes, slightly. He nodded. You're still stuck in this fantastic little mind of yours. He said, tapping her forehead. If you can step outside of that, then you'll be free. He said, going back to the seal. Will you free me? She asked him. He halted his writing and looked at her. Perhaps. He said simply, going back to his work. Ino got off the table and stripped Tashi of his ANBU attire. When there was no more need for him, she performed a low-level fire technique she knew and burned the body. When she turned around, Naruto was staring at her with a look she wasn't familiar with regarding him. It was close to amazement with a hint of further amusement. What? She asked him innocently with the burning body behind her still raging with flames. Naruto smiled at her. Nothing. But, I am done. He said, taking the paper and slapping it to his chest. It began to glow for a few seconds until Ino could visibly see the prison seal begin to slide off of his body as if someone were pouring water down his frame. Naruto's eyes shot open as if he were a junkie who just got their fix. It was the first time chakra flowed freely through his body in 5 years. Holding his hands out, he created two Rasengan and chuckled. You, doctor, have done me a great service. He stalked her, letting the balls of blue chakra die out. Ino continued to smile at him as he came closer and closer. Before he came too close, she put her fist on his chest. We're not done yet, she said, patting the ANBU uniform on the table. He raised an eyebrow but got the hint. He slipped into the uniform as Ino watched him from her seat hungrily. When he was fully dressed, he put the mask on. Let's get out of here, she said, until he stopped her. Just one more thing, he said, going through hand signs. In a puff of smoke, a naked Naruto clone stood there. Naruto wrote a few seals on his chest and the clone put his white clothes on. He then looked back over to the spot the body was being burnt. He went through a few hand signs and used a much more powerful fire technique that completely incinerated the body within seconds. When that was done, he performed a duo technique of wind and water to cool the room back down to normal temperature. From there, Ino and the ANBU left the room while the two guards came back in and escorted Naruto back to his room. They walked out of the asylum with absolutely no question being asked. No one stopped them or looked at them whatsoever. Naruto Namikaze was free. Break. Naruto left the village via the ANBU secret entrance, with Ino following his every move. When they were on the outside of the wall, Naruto breathed a sigh of relief. Well, thank you very much for your help, Dr. Yamanaka. You, I must say, have been my favorite doctor, he said as if they were parting ways. Wait. What? Ino asked, stepping closer to him. What are you talking about? She asked him urgently with a very awful feeling welling up in her stomach. Naruto raised his eyebrow at her. I am thanking you for your services up to this point, he said simply. Ino shook her head. What does that mean? Does that mean you don't need me anymore? Precisely. Now you're getting it, he said, clapping his hands together. Ino couldn't breathe. No. No, no, I fucking helped you, she yelled at him. Naruto shortened their distance in a second and pinned her to the tree behind her with her collar in his hand. No. No, what you did was try and warp my perception. You left me in a black hole of rage and confusion. Wink. Ino shook her head. No. I love you, she told him desperately. He smiled at her and began chuckling. I love you, she yelled louder. And you love me too. He let her shirt go and began to pace around. Oh, is that so? Haha. He laughed again. Yes. You do, she yelled. You feel like no one has ever loved you before, so you won't accept my love because you're afraid it's not real, she said, giving him so insight into what she deduced within her own mind. Naruto stopped in his stride. Ah, how wrong you are, he said, stalking her. No, love causes weakness when your so-called lover is weaker than you. That's why this little. The fling between us ends here, he explained, pulling a kunai from the holster on his leg. What are you gonna do? You gonna kill me? She asked. Naruto chuckled and threw the kunai her way. Ino didn't move or flinch whatsoever when the kunai hit the tree a few centimeters close to her head. Naruto seemed impressed by that, if even a little. No. No, I'm not gonna kill you, he said, stalking closer to her. If you die, it is because you're weak and this little spat of ours will have been for nothing, he said, pulling the kunai from the tree. What are you gonna do to me? She asked him, not a hint of fear in her voice whatsoever. Naruto stared her in the eye as if judging her resolve. Well, he said, turning around. Follow me and you will see. You may back out at any point of our little experiment. If you choose to do so, you may possibly have time to return before they realize you're gone, he said as she followed him through the woods. She walked right next to him and looked him in the eyes. Never, she said seriously with a fire in her eyes that Naruto just had to notice. Yeah, well, we'll see about that, he said. They walked through the woods surrounding Konoha for what felt like hours until they came upon a somewhat secluded area. Naruto bent down and pushed chakra through the ground and a secret passageway began to open up. He stood to his feet and pointed into it. After you, he said with a daring smile. Ino didn't hesitate and went right in. She stumbled through the darkness for a few seconds until the torches lining the walls seemingly lit themselves. When they did, she knew exactly where they were. They were in one of the bases of the notorious psychopath Orochimaru. There were various broken glass tubes and quarantine signs all over the place. It would seem as though this one was already disassembled, so what were they doing here? She followed Naruto as he walked deeper into the base. Soon, they entered another room and onto a platform overlooking vats of some kind of black liquid. You see that? Naruto asked her to point it out. Ino was getting a little worried at this point. That is what made me the man I am today. That is your trial. You bathe in this liquid. And I will accept this love of yours, he explained. Ino looked back into it to see it was boiling. In other words, it was probably like acid at this point and would most likely kill her. She looked at him with a broken heart. I know what you're trying to do, she said, staring at his chest, unable to look him in the eyes. You want me to kill myself. So that you don't have to deal with me anymore. she said. Naruto showed no expression at her astute observation. "No, I want you to prove your devotion," he explained. "Prove your love to me." Ino shook her head. "You know I'll die if I touch that stuff. You're not an idiot and neither am I." Still, he was unfazed. "So? You're saying you wouldn't die for me?" he asked her, casually staring her in the eyes. Ino's eyes moved up the length of his face until they were deadlocked in a staring match. He was daring her to do it. He really wanted her to die. It hurt her heart worse than if he had just taken that kunai and plunged it into her chest. After everything she's done for him, she was nothing but a nuisance to him. Ino truly believed she had found a connection in someone. Clearly her assumption was misplaced as he didn't seem to care much about her. She fell for him twice and got hurt both times. What more did she expect? She slowly backpedaled until her feet were hanging over the ledge. Turning around, the vat of chemicals was less than a foot away from the ledge. So hot, the bubbles that popped splashed up and hit her ankles, burning her a bit. If Naruto didn't want her, then no one would. More accurately, if she couldn't have Naruto, then she no longer wanted to live anymore. Maybe death was what called her at this point. Slowly, she began to fall back. In less than a second, she thought back to all of her best moments in life. Most of them involved Naruto himself. Even as she was a few milliseconds from death, she couldn't help but love the retarded psycho. This was the cause of unrequited love. Death. She could feel the heat of the vat of chemicals burning her back at this point, but she could also feel something tugging her. Opening her eyes, Naruto was holding the front of her shirt. The bottom of her hair was dipped in the chemicals, but her feet were still on the ledge. He saved her. A tear leaked out of her eye as she looked up into the blues of Naruto, who was smiling down at her. "Now that," he said with a chuckle. "That's proof." Pulling her up closer, he leaned down and kissed her. Ino melted into the passionate connection and wrapped her arms around his neck. He pulled them back onto the platform and she deepened the kiss immensely, not wanting this moment to end. A duo was born that would shake the world like natural disasters. 3 hours later, Ibiki checked over the sign-in sheet, finding it weird that Ino would come and see Naruto as late as she had last night. Especially with the circumstances of Inoichi's death, so he was headed to check on the retard to ensure he was still alive. Maybe she had done something to him. With a tray of breakfast in his hand, he opened the door. Naruto was laying on his mat staring up at the ceiling. He looked over at Ibiki but didn't say anything. "Hey Naruto," he said, walking over to him. "I was just coming to check up on you." Naruto still didn't respond. Ibiki ignored it and put the tray down next to him. "I know Ino came to see you last night," he said questioningly. "Was there? Is there any reason for that?" "No reason. Just to talk," he responded with a sudden smile. Ibiki was surprised by that. It was weird of course, but Naruto was always weird, so he didn't pay too much mind to it. "Right, well," he said, looking at his shirt. He stopped and a sickening feeling dropped to his gut. Slowly he looked into the eyes of the patient to see a mocking glint in his eyes. Ibiki knew. This was not Naruto Namikaze. The sealing ink on his body was smudged, meaning it was written with paper ink, not body ink. He pulled a kunai from his pouch and drove it into his body. He took a timid step back when it actually stabbed him. For a second he thought he was hallucinating and he actually killed a patient, but then the body disappeared in a poof of blood and smoke. God damn it. Naruto Namikaze was not here. Ibiki stood to his feet and ran out of the room as fast as he could. This was not good. This was far from good. He ran out of the asylum intent on informing the Hokage of the troubling news. No one would be ready for what was coming. No one. Chapter 9. 1 year later, the house in the middle of the forest surrounding Kumo was in an uproar of panic as the 2 remaining occupants ran for their lives. One was a brown-haired man with a cut running down the side of his face, leaking fresh blood. The other was an elderly woman who was struggling up the stairs. They were both covered in blood that wasn't all theirs. The brown-haired man pushed the older woman to make her move faster. When they were on the 2nd floor, he pushed her into the hall closet and shut the door. They both scrambled to the back wall, hidden in the shadows of the hanging clothes. The man was holding the woman's mouth shut to stop her whimpering. In the distance, they could hear the sound of someone screaming for their life. It was a man, one that they both seemed to be quite familiar with, as his cries incited more and more tears from them. Then, suddenly the screaming stopped, and they both knew why. Now, the only sound was the faint yet clear sound of footsteps slowly treading up the stairs. With every step, there was an extra 2 thuds that they couldn't place. Then, whoever it was, finally reached the top step and stopped. The house fell deathly silent for a short few seconds. Then, the assailant began walking again. This time, they could clearly hear something being dragged across the floor. It sounded sharp and metal. 2 doors away from the closet they were in, the door was kicked in roughly. When the person saw no one in there, they went to the next door and kicked it in. Again, no one. Through the shutters of the closet, the brown-haired man could now see the body of the person as they walked in front of the door. It was clearly a female by the curves of the body. She was dressed in a white form-fitting shirt underneath a red jacket that only went down to below her ribcage, which she left unzipped. She also wore a short tight pair of black shorts that didn't reach below her mid-thigh. The whole outfit was drenched in blood splatter. In her hands were two swords, held in reverse grip with the tips touching the ground. Most likely the dragging sound he heard. She was staring at their door. This one being one that opened out, she went to grab the doorknob and the brown-haired man tightened his grip on the elderly lady's mouth to keep her from screaming. Hoping and praying to whatever divine power that they somehow made it out of. He shut his eyes awaiting the inevitable. Suddenly, there was a crashing sound in the room next to theirs. The girl released the doorknob and turned her head. Now, the brown-haired man got a peek at her hair, which was blood red towards the bottom but faded into a bright blonde. She walked away to investigate what the sound was and the brown-haired man breathed a sigh of relief as quietly as he could. He loosened his grip slightly on the old lady and whispered to her to stay quiet. Slowly and gently, he crawled his way over to the door. She had already partially opened the door, so he just pushed it open a little more. It creaked ever so slightly and he cursed his luck. Looking down the hall in the direction she went, he couldn't see her. He couldn't hear her either. Seeing a chance at an escape through the window at the end of the hall, he crawled back to the old woman. Very quietly he whispered his plan. Okay. The window at the end of the hall is wide open. If we can make it, then we can run for it. The old woman was vehemently shaking her head, not liking the idea. We have to. Hey, we have to. He said more harshly. If we stay here we will die. The old woman bit her lips together and shut her eyes, mentally judging her odds. Figuring there was no other choice, she nodded her head. He nodded back at her and prepared to crawl towards the door, but quickly jumped back against the wall when he heard whistling from down the hall. Again, walking by their room was the girl stained with blood. She was still dragging one of her swords across the ground, but she was swinging the other around as she whistled. She was just about to pass by when the old woman could no longer hold her breath. She exhaled as quietly as she could, but that seemed to be enough for the girl to stop in her tracks. The brown-haired man clamped his hand over her mouth once more. The girl walked back until she was standing in front of the door again. This time, he knew they were found out. Reaching to his right, he felt around for something to use. All he could find was an old umbrella that he held shakily in his hands. The door swung open and he drove the umbrella forward, but it was quickly knocked to the side and the right side of his chest was impaled into the wall behind him. Staring up at her, he was horrified by the mask she wore. It was a traditional Japanese porcelain doll mask, complete with the small lips, thin eye holes, and a small nose. The mouth of the mask was smothered in red lipstick and both of the eyes were smudged carelessly in red eyeshadow. Beneath her right eye was a small heart and along the jawline was the word rotten. I found her, love. She called out with an ominously happy tone. They heard another pair of footsteps casually walking up the stairs. Don't worry, Granny. She said looking at the old woman. My honey just wants to talk to you. The brown-haired man tried to pull the sword from his chest, but she twisted it more and more, causing him to continue screaming. Then, they were greeted by the other masked assailant. He was wearing a blood-red shirt, black pants tucked into black tape with black sandals. Over the red shirt he wore a black hoodless jacket with a high collar that he left unzipped. The jacket and pants had many pockets on them and he had an empty sword sheath on his back. His mask was a plain expressionless white mask that cut off at his hairline. The design of the mask was blood red, very jagged and crudely painted on a smile that went from cheek to cheek. The eye holes were hardly visible amongst the blacked out smudged eyeshadow that covered them. His blood red hair was slicked back and seemed wet or oily as a strand or two hung over the front edge of his mask. Well, he said squatting down in front of the terrified old lady. Miss Kibui. Former secretary to the Hokage. The old lady did her best to sink into the wall behind her. Don't be afraid. I would just like to talk to you. My name is unimportant as I am nothing more than an idea. What do you want? Yelled the brown-haired man. The masked man looked over to him in curiosity. Then he looked back at his assailant. Why is he still alive? Sorry hun, thought you'd want to use him as leverage. She ripped a sword out of his chest and slit his throat. Flicking the blood off of the blade, she shoved it back into the empty sheath on the masked man's back. The old woman cried in desperation seeing the blood leak out from his throat. Hey, he said getting closer to the woman and stroking her face gently. There's no need for that. He whispered to her. Just answer my questions and we'll be alright. Now, the Hokage. Sitting in his office, the goddamn Hokage Menmanamikaze looked over the recent report he received on the masked assailants. It was a cry for help from a second village, this one unexpected. 2 months ago he received a distress message from the hidden sand village Kazekage Gara about 2 masked individuals who massacred one of his former associates' homes, apparently fishing for information regarding himself. It was just a simple heads up for the Hokage to ensure all of his associates were accounted for. Now, he received a letter describing the same situation from the new Mizukage, Chijuro. Kiri being a sort of neutral nation of Konoha, it was an unexpected warning. Apparently the masked assailant allowed one of the witnesses to live to relay a message to him. It was cryptic but threatening and seemed to be in pieces. This entire ordeal was becoming a headache, especially for someone who's only been in office for about 4 months so far. As of now the issue wasn't that great since the only people out of the village connected to him in any way were Sasuke and Mito. They embarked on their honeymoon a few weeks ago to Spring Country, but they could both pretty much handle anyone they came against. They were of course told to be on the lookout for Naruto even after all this time. There would be hell to pay if the other villages were to find out that the lunatic brother of the Hokage was out and about causing trouble. To Menma's knowledge, he hasn't done anything yet. He was spotted a few times with Ino of all people within a few of the minor villages, but he could never pinpoint their location. It also wasn't known if Ino is an accomplice of his or merely a victim in all this. While his father was in office, he sent multiple search and seizure missions out for the two, but only a few were able to spot them, but none able to catch them. Without Jiraiya's spy network, finding anyone became a much more difficult task for Konoha. Naruto being a former ANBU did not help as he was well aware of each and every tactic they used for certain missions. He was starting to understand his father's weary warning to him when he took office. He told him that this job was not simply about being the strongest in the village or making the tough decisions. He said it was a very hefty task of balancing not only the problems in and outside of the village, but your own life's issues as well. Naruto's escape influenced both of those tasks negatively. His disappearance led to many issues within the village, including the many demands for his head from not only the council members, but his own group of friends who believed he kidnapped Ino. Even Sakura, to Menma's disappointment. He understood it was her best friend, but Naruto was his brother and he expected her to at least understand how he felt. Ino was his friend too, so he got her point of view, but that didn't change things. As a father, Hokage, and husband Menma had a lot on his plate. Hopefully in time, everything would work itself out. He was even thinking about going to his father for help with the whole masked assailant thing. Not that he couldn't handle it. He was actually planning on relaying to every shinobi, jonin or higher, to be on the lookout for the two individuals with the orders to either capture or kill. He wasn't sure how effective that would be with a vague description of simply two masked assailants. He wasn't aware of their affiliation, ability, or even gender. It would be like chasing blank faces. For now, his plan was to wait for more information to rise. If things continued the way they were and Kumo or I were reached out with a similar complaint, then he'd definitely step up and think up a plan of action. A knock at his door broke him from his thoughts. "Come in." He called out, writing something down on the document before him. Sakura walked in with a baby carrier hooked onto her left arm and a diaper bag slung over her right shoulder. Menma smiled and stood up to greet her. Walking over he gave Sakura a kiss and received a beautiful baby laying carelessly in the carrier. "Hey there Sumire-chan," he said, pinching her cheeks. Sakura smiled, tickling her little feet. She's been missing her daddy all day. "So, I thought we'd come for a visit." Menma smiled gratefully and walked back to his seat with his daughter in his hands. "Well, I'm certainly glad you did." Taking a seat, he began to rock back and forth, uttering baby noises to make her laugh. "Today has been nothing less than stressful, I'll tell you that." Sakura walked around and set the carrier on the ground next to his chair and the diaper bag on a free spot on his desk. "I can tell. Have you ever eaten today?" Menma smiled bashfully with a chuckle. No. I must have forgotten," he said, scratching the back of his head. Sakura chuckled. "You baka. Wait here, I'll go get us something to eat," she said, walking towards the door. Menma chuckled and nodded, holding Sumire up so that they were face to face. "Dear Ka-san mean Sumire-chan. I hope you're more like me," he mocked Sakura. "Don't corrupt my daughter, you baka," she called out casually as she shut the door. Menma again chuckled at her and put his daughter back into the carrier next to him so that he could continue working. When she started crying he shoved her bottle into her mouth, silencing her instantly. A few minutes later, another knock at his door interrupted him. This time it was Kakashi. "Oh, Kakashi. What is it?" he asked, picking up Sumire so that he could feed her properly. "Meme, just stopping by to check up on you," he said, casually strolling in and taking a seat in a chair off to the side with his book in his hands. Menma's expression displayed playful annoyance. "As per my father's request?" he asked him in a knowing tone. Kakashi just smiled from behind his book. "Can't blame him for worrying. There was a lot going on when he handed you the hat." Menma sighed and looked down at Sumire. "I know, but still. I am Hokage for a reason. He doesn't have to worry about me all the time." Kakashi shrugged. "Guess it's a parent thing." Menma smiled at that, looking down at his daughter, figuring he'd probably do the same thing. "Well, tell him thanks for checking up on me, but I'm fine," he said in amusement. Kakashi smiled and nodded. "Will do." "Well, I'm here, anything you'd like to talk about?" he asked him. Menma looked up in thought. "Well, yeah actually." He shifted Sumire to his other arm. "There could be a possible issue brewing that could possibly affect us later down the road," he said, getting serious. "What's the threat level?" Kakashi asked, putting his book away. Menma shook his head at the question. "I'm not really sure. 2 masked individuals attacked associates of the cage demanding information on them," he explained. Kakashi looked up in thought. "What do you mean by associates?" Menma used his free hand to rummage through the piles of paper on his desk. Former sensei of the Kazekage. The previous Mizukage, Mei Terumi," he said, reading the report. "The former cage?" Kakashi asked in surprise. Menma nodded his head. "Well, that means that they definitely have some kind of power," he remarked. "Both of them sound as though they would have some kind of knowledge on their cage's personal life. That's what I'm afraid of," he said with a nod. "Sasuke and Mito are out on their honeymoon. And you think they would dare attack them? They are both S-rank shinobi within the bingo book," Kakashi said. Menma nodded. "Yeah, but if they were confident enough to attack a former cage, I doubt they'd shy away from that," he said. "True," Kakashi said, thinking of all the information presented to him. "Well, maybe we can use that," he said, thinking up a plan. "Yeah, inform Sasuke and Mito of the imminent threat of 2 masked assailants, and they may possibly be able to defeat them and end whatever the two have planned," he explained. "Cut the head of the snake before it can strike." Menma thought it over. It was a sound plan, but he didn't really want to give his sister and new brother-in-law a mission during their honeymoon. Though, this was a matter of village security, so he may have to. It would be better to have them vigilant out there if someone were actually planning to attack them. No matter how good of a shinobi you may be, you are still vulnerable to unplanned attacks. The key was to prepare for everything. "Yeah, okay," he said with a nod. "I'll send a carrier pigeon as soon as possible." Wiping the blood from her mask, Ino happily strolled alongside Naruto who, as usual, had a book shoved in front of his masked face. It's been a year since their escape from the village. Immediately after the whole chemical death initiation thing, they began a string of very confusing missions. It was like Naruto had planned out everything he wanted to do when he got out. Ino knew it was along the lines of malicious intent and most likely criminal activity, but she didn't really care. In fact, she was starting to almost enjoy the things they did. They were bad, but for some reason they gave her a rush she hadn't felt in. Well ever. Their first 2 months of freedom were spent traveling the various nations, digging up dirt and learning of the brewing alliances among the nations. There seemed to be more than a few. Iwa was apparently in contact with Konoha about squashing the recent conflicts between them in place of joining into an alliance with them, and Suna. Kiri was still remaining neutral but was very interested in the budding alliances of the other nations. And Kumo was for the most part interested. It almost seemed like the world was nearing a peaceful time. They also dug up the dirt of the underground organizations of each of the nations. Konoha's route was seemingly in conflict with Kumo's Bolt organization. It was all very interesting to Naruto. He and Ino had been plotting their game plan every step of the way. As of recently, they've been hunting down personal information on the cage themselves. For what? Ino wasn't truly sure, but she knew it would be something. Currently, according to Naruto, they would need an army of their own before beginning their true goal. So, they were now traveling through the fields of Sunagakure in search of something. Or someone. Ino peeked over his shoulder. "Wachiriaden?" she asked in a playful manner as she slipped her mask back on. "Oh, it's an absolutely dreadful book about this man's ridiculous theory on where we go when we die," he explained. Ino put her hands behind her back and swayed her shoulders as they walked. "What does he think?" Naruto pulled the book down from his face. "Well, he believes there is some sort of purgatory that we go to await our judgment from Kami," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Ino smiled beneath her mask. "You don't think that place exists?" she asked him, leaning forward to peek into his eye holes. "No," he said immediately. "No, that's just a scare tactic to force people into acting like civilized individuals." "So what happens when we die?" Ino asked him. Naruto sighed and looked up to the night sky and thought. We're just gone. There's no purgatory, no afterlife, no heaven, no hell. There is just non-existence. So you've never believed in religion?" "No. No, you see, religion is the human race showing its fear of being the top of the food chain. Aside from what people may believe, we are the superior species. Some could argue the tailed beasts, but they have been captured and contained for over a century. We are the most intelligent and intelligence is power." Ino was confused. "Well, how does that tie in?" "Humanity fears power even though we all crave it. Therefore, they create stories of something a step higher so that everything that happens is for a reason in their eyes," he explained. Ino just smiled at him and grabbed his free hand on her own. "You sure have thought about this, haven't you?" She leaned her head against his shoulder as they walked. Naruto chuckled. Well, when you're locked up for 5 years it gives you some time to think. I'm sorry I didn't get you out sooner. She said sincerely. Naruto waved her off. That is not important. Patience is a virtue, I would have waited another year if I had to. Well, you didn't have to. She said, hopping onto his back. Effortlessly, Naruto caught her with his hands beneath her knees as he continued walking. And I am grateful for that. He said as Ino moved the strands of hair hanging over his mask. Which is why I keep you around. Ino snickered in disbelief. TCH, yeah. It's not because you love me or anything like that. She said in a playful tone. Naruto chuckled. Dr. Yamanaka, you are too much. Up ahead they could see a group of people walking their way. Looks like we have company, dear. She said, swinging her feet playfully. Naruto just snorted and continued along the path, undeterred. As they got closer and closer, they could make out what seemed to be a 4-man squad, possibly a team of genin and their sensei. Getting even closer, they could now see that they were from Konoha. The sensei was someone neither of them knew personally. It was a fairly muscular man with dark brown hair. His 3 genin stood behind him in fear of the 2 masked individuals they were about to pass. Naruto's eye holes peered into the brown-haired sensei with absolutely no emotion. In an attempt to maintain his composure, the man gave him a nod. Naruto paused for a slight second before nodding back. Ino was playing with the children behind him, staring at them with a smile beneath her mask. She tilted her head cutely, completely creeping them out with the blood-smeared markings on her mask and the few droplets still clinging to her legs. The sensei and his students breathed a sigh of relief when they passed the 2. Naruto just continued walking, not paying them any more attention. Ino was looking back at them for no apparent reason. The sensei turned around to check on his students and saw her looking back. He pushed them in front of him and continued walking. Ino turned back and chuckled into Naruto's ear. Break. Hours later, Naruto and Ino walked into a bar on the outskirts of Kusa. Sticking to the shadows of the shady place, they made their way to a very dark corner overlooking the people within. They sat there for a few hours until the individual they seemed to be waiting for finally made an entrance. A man with curly black hair and a scar running down his right eye. Naruto nudged Ino and she nodded, taking her mask off. Ino walked over to the free spot on the bar right next to the man, with a sway to her hips and a seductive smile plastered on her face. Leaning on the counter, she tapped her fingers against the countertop. Hey barkeep. I'd like a few shots. She said, getting the attention of the target. She could feel his eyes on her as she waited for her order. The barkeep came back and asked her how many she wanted, and she replied 2. When he filled the glasses up, the target took that as a conversation starter. Hey. He quipped. Those both for you? Ino smirked his way as if she hadn't noticed him there. Of course they are. She said slyly. Girls are a little thirsty. She said, downing one of the glasses with little effort. The curly-haired man watched her the whole time. Well, in that case, let me buy you 2 more. He said, pulling out his wallet. The barkeep poured 2 more glasses. I'm Kai. He held his hand out for her to shake. Ino. She replied, shaking the appendage. She smiled at him knowing she was successful in her tactics. From there, she laid on the charm to the best of her abilities, which were a lot better than most. She talked him up with a small chat that made her want to slit her own throat. He wasn't necessarily dumb, but he was nowhere near the level of intellectual dialect she was used to. For the next 3 to 4 hours, she did well in talking him up and utilized her knowledge of psychology to get the information she needed from him. Somewhere along the way, they decided to leave the bar. With Naruto, unknowingly to Kai, following close behind. Naruto was spot on with picking this target. Apparently he was the leader of a very large group of nuke ninja and rogue samurai who despised the major shinobi countries for various reasons. They were a nameless underground circuit that had been around for more than a few years but had yet to take any major action for what he idiotically admitted to her was because of his own fear of being found out. Knowing the new information, Ino showed him her headband and expressed her desire to join his organization. Kai was at first unsure about it, saying they didn't usually take anyone who wasn't marked nuke in the bingo book. That's when she revealed she was one of the masked assailants that attacked the Kazekage sensei and the previous Mizukage, the 2 cases people were likely aware about at this point. I was surprised by that information, since those 2 individuals were starting to pop up on everyone's radar. He seemed to have a spy network a lot more complex and functional than the one the San and Jiraiya had in the past. Ino found it strange yet fitting that it seemed the only thing holding him back from causing true trouble for the world was his own cowardice. More importantly, she knew more about what Naruto was trying to do. They needed an adequate army, and it would seem as though they found one that could use a new leader. The more Kai explained it, the better it seemed to get. After he agreed she could join, he explained the functioning of the ranking and the members they have. They worked in a fairly organized manner with higher-ups, consisting of the highest-class nuke ninja, who reported information to himself directly. There were over 200 members in Kusa alone at the moment. At least 200 more either undercover or stationed elsewhere. All of them with a deep hatred for one or all of the major villages. Ino continued to lay the charm onto him until he finally decided to take her to the headquarters. On the way, Ino began badgering him about questions of himself. He was sure that he was the most powerful shinobi among their ranks, claiming he had to be to remain in power. Apparently, he was tested by a few high-ranked members before. They were actually notable individuals as well. People Ino had noticed from the bingo books whose bounties were cashed in. The most notable being the puppet master Sasori of Sunagakure. Kai instilled fear of his power among his ranks to gain the respect of his people, but he feared he was losing it. The problem was the people wanted action. They wanted something to assure them that this organization was going to do something soon. Kai, however, was unsure about this. His grandfather was the one to start this many years ago, and it was passed down to him as his father died in service. He was trained by his grandfather ruthlessly, and he admitted to Ino he really had no passion for harming the major villages. He had no reason for it. He was born and raised with the underground headquarters since birth. Ino decided, to keep it real, she would give him some advice. "You know, if you don't take action soon, your people won't respect you," she said with a knowing tone. "Or someone may come around and take them from you." I smiled bashfully. "Yeah, I know. I don't know, maybe we'll start our own village. We've got a lot of members," he said. Ino shook her head with a hum of uncertainty. "Changing your purpose will make them leave faster." I explained he knew this and said he had been working on a way to propose the idea to the forces. He had just been too nervous to actually do it. Ino saw this as an opportunity to possibly take even more action. She pecked him on the cheek with a seductive smile. "They say a strong woman can give a man strengths he never knew he had." I looked over to her with a small grin tugging at his lips. "What is it you're proposing, Ms. Ino?" She placed her hand inside his with a bashful smile. "Tell your troops your idea. I'll be with you every step of the way." I looked around the forest floor in thought. I don't know," he said timidly. "I'll lose some of them." Ino nodded. "True, but the ones who stay are the ones who are really there for you." She could see the realization and subtle belief in her words play out on his visage. He looked at the ground in front of them as they walked and he squeezed her hand gently. After a few moments, he looked over to her with a small smile and he nodded. Ino understood the gesture and rested her head on his shoulder. They walked for a few more minutes until they crossed a field. Reaching the other side, he pushed chakra through the ground in a 3-round burst and a pathway opened up, leading underground. They were greeted by someone Ino knew of very well. "Dadara, I was Mad Bomber." Another night of bar hopping, huh?" he asked him incredulously. Showing the respect he demanded, he walked right by him with his arm around Ino. "It's leader Sama to you and yes, another night of bar hopping." Dadara scowled at the back of his head as he followed the two. "How many men are here?" But the deadpan tone he replied. "Close to 200. "Great, have everyone in the main room. I have an announcement," he said walking further in with Ino. Naruto was a few paces behind the three, silently watching and casually strolling along, unnoticed. Madara split away from the two to relay the message. Walking through a corridor, Kai and Ino passed two throne-like chairs, looking out to what she assumed was the main hall, as there were already more than 100 people scattered around, either training, eating or just casually talking. The room was absolutely massive, much larger than she assumed it would be. She and Kai walked forward passing the beautifully sculpted thrones down about 3 steps onto a small balcony overlooking the room. There were a lot of other corridors lining the sides of the gigantic room with people funneling out, filling the main room within minutes. Ino watched from Kai's side as men and women chatted amongst themselves waiting for the meeting to start. Below them was a raised and rounded area, seeming to be a platform for battle or entertainment. It was connected to a hall directly underneath them. Funneling out of it were 7 people she assumed to be the higher-ups. Individuals such as Dadara I was Mad Bomber, Kisame Hoshigaki, the tailless-tailed beast, Haiden, the immortal, Aoi Rakusho, the thief of the sword of the thunder god, Zabuza Mamachi, demon of Kurigakure, Kakuzu, the man who fought Hashirama Senju, and Pukura, former hero of Sunagakure. It was a very lethal group of individuals that Ino found impressive. They were all S-rank criminals with a deep hatred for the major villages. Now, she was actually feeling slightly nervous. If they were faithful to Kai, then this wouldn't work. Squeezing Ino's hand once more, Kai began the announcement. There was a seal placed on the balcony that allowed him to be heard around the entire room. He walked forward and got the attention of the waiting listeners. "People," he said. "I have an important announcement." The entire room was completely drenched in silence, some of them thinking up what they thought he was going to say. Most of them hoped they were finally going to do something. As you all know, the primary goal of this organization has been the destruction of the major villages. He looked back at Ino who nodded at him with 2 thumbs up and a comically insane-looking smile. He found it weird but ignored it and continued. "As of recently, we've been dormant in our actions." This statement got a wave of chuckles and giddy noises from the crowd. Everyone believed they knew where this was going. I have a plan. He said, getting the people even more excited. Ino could see the eager body language of the 7 higher-ups below them and felt more reassured. They wanted to attack just as much as everyone else. His next statement caused an even greater reaction. My plan is to abandon our previous objective and instead start our own village. The people were dead silent for a moment, trying to process what he said. When they did, the room erupted into outrageous shouts of anger. Kai watched them yell their discrepancies at him silently for a moment. Flashing his highly intense killer intent, he froze the room almost instantly. Ino was actually surprised by it. She realized he was a lot stronger than she imagined. The 7 higher-ups jumped up to the balcony to demand an answer. Haydn, being the most vulgar, began badgering him immediately. Kai. What the hell are you talking about? He yelled incredulously. I didn't waste 3 years of my fucking life to be pulled back into another fucking village. You're an immortal jackass, but he's right. Yelled Madara. The hell is wrong with you? I stared at them indifferently with his hands behind his back. We won't be a regular village. He tried to explain. Yeah, no shit. We're made up of missing ninja. Aoi said casually as if he were speaking to an idiot. Zabuza pulled his sword from his back. The only reason we are here is because of the mission, he said, pointing his blade at him. Kai stared at him unintimidated. Oh, Zabuza is gonna challenge him? Kisum said with an amused tone. This is making Sharkskin tremble. I walked forward and stared him in the eyes. That mission was started by my grandfather. He was a fool to believe he could take on the likes of the 5 Cage. He said in a threatening way. If you wish to try and take my place, then by all means. He said threateningly. Zabuza couldn't even maintain eye contact with him. The others could see his sword slowly sinking down out of Kai's face. It was a strange sight for Ino to see, the demon of the mist shying away from an enemy. In front of a fellow swordsman no less. Know your place, Mamachi. Kai said casually, stepping past them to continue his speech. The 7 of them turned along with him, seemingly going along with him. I understand the issue with this, but I urge you to allow me to explain. He said, waiting for someone to say something. When they didn't, he continued. The qualms of my grandfather do not extend to me. I have no hatred for the hidden villages, and I understand that you may. If so, I urge you to take it upon yourself to take action in your own way. If your hate is pure, then you will have no issue doing so. Well, if that's not cowardice, then I don't know what is. Said a new voice from behind him. The group upon the balcony turned around in surprise at the man brave enough to disrespect this monster before them. Naruto stepped around the thrones with his mask on and his hands behind his back. Ino, who was still behind the group, smirked at Kai, who looked at her in suspicion. She slyly placed her mask back on her head, and when Naruto got next to her, she leaned on his shoulder. Kai Akutaka said slowly. Who are you? Kai asked blankly, showing no fear or emotion of any kind. Naruto tilted his head slightly. It is of no importance who I am. What's important is my plan and the necessities I need to complete it. He said casually, walking around. You see, like these beautiful people around you, I have a certain abhorrence for the hidden villages. I just stared at him in confusion and slight annoyance. Aoi, kill him. He said suddenly. Aoi drew his sword, but Naruto opened his jacket, displaying the paper bombs inside, and formed the hand sign ready to blow them. Shaking his head. Let's not blow this out of proportion. Listen, Kai, as I understand, you are a man who invites challenges. Kai turned his way, staring at him. You wish to challenge me to take my place? He asked him threateningly, flashing his killer intent at the Redeed, who was not affected in the slightest. Why, that's a splendid idea. He said with a smile beneath his mask. You see, these people deserve a better leader. He said, addressing the crowd of onlookers listening to the tense conversation. They don't need a spineless man afraid of his own demise. I jumped back and off of the balcony, landing on the circular platform, ready to fight. Naruto rolled his right shoulder out and slowly walked forward, paying no mind to the 7 high-classed killers who looked at him as if he were a fool. You will die here today, Kai. It is your fear of death that will be your demise. He said, stepping off the ledge. He landed on the opposite side of the platform, staring across the way at the curly-haired man. You seem so sure of yourself. Kai said with a bit of a smirk. If you had any common sense, you'd look around and see that your confidence may be misplaced. It is not. Naruto said simply, rolling up his left sleeve. He pushed chakra into the marking on his forearm and a sheathed sword and strap popped up. I am merely aware of the ending to this match. You know nothing of me, but I know everything about you. He strapped the sword to his back and unsheathed it. I raised an eyebrow in confusion. Have we met before? Naruto shook his head. No, but I've met you. You're a cowardly man, hiding behind power. He said, holding his sword in a reverse grip. You are too kind for the role you play, which is why you refuse to take action. A man like you does not belong in an organization like this period, yet you lead it because no one has been able to best you. And you believe you can?" He asked him casually. Naruto gave him a curt nod and said nothing else. Kai nodded back cockily and walked to the edge of the arena. He held his hand out to one of the nearby men, never taking his eyes off of Naruto. "Sword." The man pulled it from its sheath and handed it to him. "Well then, let's see it." With that, the two rushed forward. Kai went for a wild diagonal slash that Naruto blocked with his own. Spinning with the block, Kai went for an elbow to Naruto's face, but Naruto caught it and pushed it forward, spinning him back the other way. Ducking under the next violent slash, Naruto spun on his knees with his sword out from his body, nearly cutting Kai's leg. Getting to his feet, he jumped back, avoiding the stab from above as Kai lodged his sword into the ground. Pulling it out, he jumped towards Naruto who had just landed. Naruto fell back to his back as Kai came in for a roundhouse. While his leg was above him, Naruto jabbed him in the spot behind his knee. Kai landed and fell over when his leg gave out. He rolled out the way when Naruto threw his sword down where his chest would have been. The unarmed Naruto rolled forward and caught Kai's wrist before he could continue his slash. He leaned his head out of the way of the right straight and kicked him in the chest, sending him tumbling backwards. Kai stood up on his unresponsive leg and scowled at the redeed. Naruto rushed him and grabbed his sword on the way. He slid on his side, avoiding the bunch of kunai thrown by the curly-haired man. Kai jumped and threw his sword down, hoping to impale the still sliding enemy, but Naruto expertly shifted his body over, missing the blade by a hair. He rolled again, barely missing the ground-breaking stomp that nearly crushed his body. Kai yelled in rage and threw his sword forward, missing the blonde and instead impaling one of the watchers in the head. Naruto looked back momentarily and paid for it when he returned his gaze as Kai was already in his face, delivering a kick to his chest that made him lose grip on his blade. Before he could grab it, Kai jumped up and kicked it away. Naruto took that distraction and grabbed onto his raised leg. He held it until Kai fell back onto his back and kicked him away. They both rolled to their feet and rushed again. Kai slid down, avoiding the flying straight kick as Naruto flew over him. Getting back to his feet, he blocked the redeed's follow-up spinning back kick with ease and delivered a barrage of his own punches into his momentarily exposed ribs. Naruto hopped back and cradled his chest with green chakra emitting from his hands. He didn't have much time as a barrage of kunai flew his way, he jumped out of the way and the watchers behind him deflected the blades, suspending them above the platform. Acting quickly, Naruto kicked one forward and grabbed another. The one he kicked forward was caught by Kai who was already rushing him. Naruto parried his strike with a slash of his own. The two were deadlocked in a struggle of strength. Hand in hand, kunai and kunai. Kai peered into the black eye holes faintly seeing the cold, lifeless blues staring back at him. Loosening his wrist, Naruto allowed Kai's kunai to hurt himself, stabbing him in the shoulder as he plunged one into his thigh. "Arg!" Kai yelled, kicking him back with his other leg. Naruto rolled with a hit and stood back to his feet, now fresh out of weapons. Kai was now limping as he struggled to stay on his feet. Naruto rushed him, ignoring the injury to his shoulder. He engaged him, throwing a feint right hook that Kai leaned back to avoid. When he did, Naruto jabbed him in his injured thigh. "Arg!" He yelled again, dropping down to his knee. Naruto stood over him as if he already won. His breathing was steady and he didn't seem as though he even fought yet, other than the blood leaking from the hole in his shoulder. Kai's eyes were traveling around the room, looking at the people who were looking at the spectacle in shock. No one said a word, they just watched on in disbelief. "This is the peak performance of your so-called unstoppable leader?" he asked in a condescending way. "Not bad, but I have definitely had better battles." I chuckled and stood back to his feet. "Oh, believe me, I've got a lot more," he said as he started to walk back into the tunnel. Naruto raised his eyebrow, wondering if he had given up. "Close combat is not my forte. If you'd really like a battle, we should take it outside." Naruto watched him for a second before following. Break. The hefty group of people now circled around the field outside of their hidden base. Everyone is trying to cram around to see the fight. It had been so long since they witnessed their leader go all out and it would seem he would have to if he wanted to win this fight. When everyone settled in, the field was completely quiet aside from Ino, who was sharpening Naruto's discarded blade off to the side with the 7 higher-ups. Naruto stood calmly on the other side of the field, waiting for Kai to do whatever it is he believed would win him this fight. Kai was still trying to get used to the pain in his leg by bouncing on the balls of his feet a few times. With a sigh, he stopped. He pulled his shirt off, revealing a body riddled with tattoos of all kinds. He looked over at Naruto who was as unintimidated as he had been the whole time. "I am finished with this game of cat and mouse," he said with conviction in his voice. "You wish to lead my people, I will not make it easy for you." Naruto said nothing. He took off running across the field intent on continuing their battle. A few feet away from him, he jumped to his left, dodging the ball of flames headed his way. immediately being forced to move again as another one came soaring towards him. Using his limited knowledge of Earth, he slammed his hands into the ground and a wall shot up in front of him, barely standing up against a ball of flames that collided with it. I watched the smoke clear away for a brief second before jumping up and away from the hands that popped out trying to snag his feet. Naruto jumped out of the ground and began rushing him again, performing a string of hand signs along the way. Kai blew another fireball his way which Naruto jumped over. Seeing this, Kai blew another one, but Naruto had finished his hand signs and blew a ball of water bigger than Kai expected, dousing his flame and coating the field in a thick mist. Kai jumped from the mist, not wanting to be caught in a trap. He stared into the cloud of white, awaiting some kind of movement. A shot of an air bullet tore through the mist too quickly for Kai to avoid completely, so he leaned out the way slightly causing the bullet to shoot through his arm. Grimacing at the pain, he jumped out of the way of the next two, avoiding them narrowly. Naruto went through even more hand signs and blew a ball of flames at the curly-haired man. When Kai jumped away to avoid it, Naruto smirked beneath his mask, pulling at the thin ninja wire in his hands. Kai noticed the wire just in time and contorted his body clear of being tangled in it. In doing so, he didn't notice the Redeed come in with a brutal knee to his ribcage, sending him tumbling back down to the ground. He held his ribs and looked up at the two Redeeds who began walking towards him. He looked around at the people that were giving him the same look they were before. The look that told him he was losing. In truth, this was all he had. This man before him was too powerful. The people feared his almighty strength because he was able to easily beat Sasori, but in truth, he had help in doing so. It would seem he needed that help here as well. He stood up with a very intense look in his eyes. He took a few steadying breaths before he rolled his shoulders out. With a somewhat painful expression, a tattoo on the back of his neck began to glow an orange almost red color and began to expand. Like markings of flames, it began expanding across his body rapidly, stopping just past his nose, almost reaching his other eye. The orange faded to black and the markings looked like regular tattoos. He felt amazing. Naruto watched him in interest. "I knew you were a snake," he said slowly, crouching down lower into his fighting stance. Kai's eyes lit up in excitement. The power within him was overbearing but incredible. With a crazy look in his eyes, he took off. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoy it. If you want the next part of this video, turn on that bell notification. Like, subscribe and comment down below. And also check out the others videos I have created and enjoyed it. See you guys next video.